The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to continue our lecture about personality. Previously, we covered what personality is, what type of traits can you find. Also, we talked about one of the more recognized models of personality. So, for example, your basic models, such as the Big Five. And we also talked about psychodynamic perspectives as to what we use to inform our personality. So today we're going to continue with aspects of personality, as well as other schools of thought that attempt to explain what personality is and where it comes from. So let's get started. Now, today we are going to talk about B.F. Skinner. Now, B.F. Skinner, if you remember from previous chapters, he was immensely oriented in the field of behaviorism. And as a quick reminder, what is behaviorism? Well, if you recall from previous lectures, we talked about that behaviorism is focused on that you can observe, right? Aspects that you can observe. Therefore, they would argue that in order to conduct a scientific study, it was impossible to focus on things we cannot see. Therefore, they would pose the idea, if psychology were to be scientific, we cannot study things that are not observable behavior. And I like to think about that in the sense that what would you be able to record, right? What would you be able to record with a video camera? Because if I were to tell you, let's record sadness, how do we record sadness? A person crying, right? I can record a person weeping. So behaviorists would say, well, I can record sadness, but I can't record somebody weeping, or I can record somebody crying. Therefore, their focus was simply on things that I could observe. Now, how do we apply these ideas that Skinner proposed? How do we apply them to personality? Now, he considers the importance of determinism. Now, we have observed determinism before in previous lectures, and something that I need to remind you, just as a quick review, is that in the sense of determinism, he would argue that behavior is solely determined by the stimuli around you. So he would pose, if you engage in a behavior, for example, me picking this shirt today, right? Me wearing this shirt today, he would argue the only reason you decided to wear that shirt today is because of aspects in your environment. Or, for example, it's hotter today, right? So I decided to wear a short sleeve polo shirt. So he would pose that personality is simply that response that tends to be a sort of constant and tends to be a tendency. And it's simply tied to the situations, right? The stimuli around you. So for example, if we use the aspect of extroversion, for instance, notice that he would say, well, the only reason you're extroverted is because of that stimuli around you, not necessarily because of some other force that we can determine. So he would argue that it doesn't come from other aspects. If you recall from previous chapters, you'll remember in previous lectures, you'll remember that we have operant conditioning, right? He would say that the only reason you have these types of responses, it's because you've been conditioned to exert some responses. So for example, if you're considered to be introverted, right? If you're considered to be an introverted individual, he would say, well, you've been conditioned into being introverted because of the stimuli that you have received in the past. So any questions about that? Good deal. Now, because of that, one of his arguments was that he considered that personality development is based on a continuum, right? That your personality is a lifelong journey. This is a little bit different when we think about other aspects of personality that we've talked about in the past. So for example, we talked about saying how personality tends to be continuous and tends to be the same, right? It doesn't really change as much unless, I believe it was Dr. Nunez or Dr. Abbey that brought that up in our previous lecture, which was what about trauma, right? Can trauma shape your personality? So notice that unless there's a very significant factor, generally our personality tends to remain the same. Any questions about that? Fantastic, good deal. So we also have another perspective, right? We have another perspective, and that is of Albert Bandura. Now, Albert Bandura, he proposed aspects regarding the social cognitive theory. Now, when we were talking previously about Skinner, we were mainly focused on behaviorism, right? Behaviorism. Now, we are still doing that focus, but now we're moving a little bit towards the aspect of learning. So Bandura would argue that the reason your personality is shaped is because you are learning. So notice that with Skinner, it was very similar, but that you were learning and moving because of the stimuli that you were exposed to. Now, what Bandura would argue is somewhat similar, but he would say that because of your desire to learn, because of your intent of seeking and processing information about those stimuli, about that environment around you, you're trying to maximize favorable outcomes. And what does that mean in the Queen's English, right? So let's think about how we are around our environment. Say, for instance, you are trying to talk to the person right next to you. So for example, you need a refresher about something that I mentioned in previous lectures. I'm like, hey, what's the name of the YouTube channel so that I can go back and watch some lectures. But notice that you're trying to gauge in your environment. And the person right next to you says, I don't know, or don't ask me, right? You're going to learn because of that stimuli that perhaps that extroverted factor of trying to engage with someone, now you learn that that was not a favorable outcome, right? Because you didn't get what you wanted, which is like, hey, can I get information about the class? But notice that if the person right next to you, yeah, sure, this is the channel, this is the name of the lecture or whatever, then you'll know, okay, this led to a favorable outcome. Therefore, I'm going to learn and how to engage in that favorable outcome. Now, this here is immensely important. We did talk about observational learning in the past. And if you recall in previous lectures, I mentioned that back in my day, we used to call this modeling. Now we refer to it as observational learning. I prefer modeling because I like to think about role models and I like to think about how we use other people. We use the observations that we have upon others in order to inform our own responses, right? Our own responses. So if you recall, we had observed some of the aspects of the experiment of Bobo the clown, right? And if you recall, the child in that specific case was looking into a model, right? A confederate. And this person was banging and was hitting an inflatable clown toy. And then the child, simply by observing, he and her, because there was another girl participating, notice that they influenced, right? They were influenced by observing that other person in order to inform their responses. Now, why does that matter? Why does that matter? Because I am going to try to model, right? That individual, right? That person that I'm using to inform our behavior. So imagine if you are considered, say, for example, when you were really young, and say when you were really young, you were, say, for instance, a very tame child, right? You didn't get in a lot of trouble. You're basically pretty quiet. But then as you started getting older, notice that, say, for example, in your family, you would observe, say, mom hitting dad, or your grandparents hitting each other, or dad hitting mom, and everybody hitting each other. Notice that you're going to use that model, right? You're going to use that model that you have in order to inform your own responses. So perhaps your personality wasn't aggressive or violent, but because we have used models to inform our own responses, now your personality, it would say, hey, don't mess, people would say, hey, don't mess with Billy because he's super violent. Is he super violent, or did he use that information to inform his own personality, his own responses later on? So next time that Billy is on campus and somebody says, hey, Billy, you look like a dork, right? He's going to act immensely violent, right, to that aspect. When in reality, was it really that was an aspect of his personality, or was it influenced by others' behavior? Notice a very significant aspect, which is self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is basically your ability, is basically your own belief that your behavior should inherently lead to expected outcomes, right? So what does that mean? Notice that if I engage in a certain behavior, right? So if I engage in a certain behavior and say, if I beat somebody up, the expected outcome is that they're going to give me their lunch money, right? That will be my self-efficacy, right? I'm going to get a desired or expected outcome, which is people are going to give me their money. But notice that in this particular case, when the person does not receive that expected outcome, say they go to detention, or maybe they're adults and then they go to jail, they go to prison, notice that that was not the expected outcome. So, any questions about that? Now, let's talk about other perspectives, right? So we talked about psychodynamic perspectives, I should say, previously, and we talked about behaviorism. Let's talk about other aspects. Let's talk about other aspects that are indeed related to the explanation. As you know, we have different schools of thought in psychology, and one of them is the humanistic perspective. Now, when we are talking about humanistic perspective, humanism is a school of thought that I like to call what the Army slogan used to be back in the day, which was be all you can be, right? And humanism, what this school of thought proposes is that generally individuals are going to have unique qualities, right? Persons are going to have unique qualities, I should say. And the perspective of humanistic psychology is that I am going to try for you as your therapist to be able to help you in reaching that maximum potential that you can actually reach, right? So, for example, for some individuals, I do like using humanistic psychology in therapy. It is a little bit difficult because we expect that you are already in a decent enough place, because if you don't have anything to eat, you don't have a roof over your head, right? How can we reach that maximum potential, right? So we need to satisfy basic needs first, and then moving upward towards the realization of your maximum potential. Now, having said that, what does humanistic psychology and school of thought assume? One of the assumptions that we make, just like in statistics, is individuals have the ability to rise above just those primitive needs. If you recall, in psychodynamic perspective, there were a lot of primitive needs. So for example, your need for pleasure, your need for reproduction, those are very basic needs. Those are very primitive and animal needs. And are they present? Of course they're present. But humanistic psychologists would propose, and researchers, they would propose that you do indeed have the ability. You do have the ability to not just only, say, for example, ask somebody on a date because you have a primitive instinct of reproduction. They would say, well, there's that, but also you have the ability to rise above it. Now, contrary to the psychodynamic perspective, the humanistic perspective proposes that you are indeed conscious, that you are a rational being, and that you are not necessarily dominated by all of these unconscious factors. So if you recall from previous lectures, when you are guided with your behavior, the things that you use to inform your behavior are aspects involving your unconscious. So contrary to the psychodynamic perspective, when we are thinking about personality and your levels of awareness, notice that humanistic psychologists are only focusing in this aspect here. They're only focusing on the aspects of the conscious, whereas in regards to the psychodynamic perspective, they place an extensive emphasis on the unconscious. So Freud would propose that we are very dominated by that unconscious, that everything you do is based on those primitive unconscious needs because of your trauma, because of pleasure principle, whereas humanistic psychologists, well, that's not the main part. That's not the focus. The focus that we need to worry about is
what we can control.
What we can't control, right? And that leads us to the third assumption, which is we're not helpless, right? Humanistic psychologists and researchers propose we are not helpless. So that is contrary to our previous aspects of, say, for example, behaviorism. Behaviorism proposed, well, your behavior is already determined, right? Because of that stimulant that you are surrounded with. But notice that humanistic psychologists propose, you're not helpless because of determinism, right? They consider that you actually have more of the ability to lead and guide your behavior and become self-actualized, become the person that you want to be. So how does this relate to our personality? How does this relate to our personality? Well, one of the things that we need to view is that Rogers proposed the person-centered theory. In regards to person-centered theory, this is something that I use extensively in my own practice, right? As you know, I practice under supervision, and this is something that I intensely focus on in therapy, because many times when a client and a patient show up to a therapy session, they generally show up with this perspective. And that is what we would call incongruence. When we're talking about this aspect, notice that the concept that I have about myself, the concept that of the person that I want to be, that I wish I am, is not colliding correctly, is not meshed correctly, and does not align with the actual experience. With therapy, however, with humanistic therapy and with person-centered therapy, notice that the intent is to provide a sense of congruence, which is I'm trying to make that self-concept, I'm trying to make it align, I'm trying to make it mesh with your actual experience. Notice that there's always going to be some incongruence, right? Notice that there are aspects that you simply cannot match, right? So for example, how does this relate to therapy in the real world, right? So imagine that I have a client, right? And this person is, say, depressed because their self-concept, they want to be independent, they want to be, say, for example, a good employee, a good student, a good father, or a good mother. But notice that that's the idea of self-concept. But then when I ask them, okay, so what's going on, right? What's going on with your family? And they would say, well, I'm happy because I live with my parents and I wish I was more independent, or I don't have a vehicle, or there's a lot of things I can do with myself, or I should say by myself. So notice that idea of the self-concept and the idea of what's actually occurring is not aligning. They're actually very separate. So in therapy, what we're trying to do is find that aspect. What is stopping this person to become self-actualized, right? What is stopping that person from having an increased self-concept. And whenever that happens, then we can start aligning that self-concept with the actual environment, what was actually occurring, and then we manage to align the two. This is very difficult in regards to sometimes persons who are depressed, right? Because sometimes people who are depressed can't even see their own abilities, right? They can't see the fact that there are things they can do or they excel at. So it is pretty difficult. It's really difficult for some individuals to view this. Now, Rogers would propose that the way that these influences happen, the way for us to be congruent or incongruent with our environment, notice that he would say that the aspect that we would view is conditional love, conditional love. And in regards to Rogers, he would say that conditional love is detrimental for you to reach your self-actualization. So notice, for example, that say your family wanted you to be an engineer because that's what you had to do, right? That's what you had to be, hashtag relatable, right? My family wanted me to be an engineer. I was decent enough with numbers that I think I could have probably wiggled my way around it. But that was not something that I wanted to be. That's not something that I would like to become and would lead me to be self-actualized. So because of that, that is what we would define as conditional love. I love you though, but you gotta be an engineer, because if you're not an engineer, I don't know how well I'm going to like you for the rest of your life. So that is considered conditional love. The problem with that is that if we have conditional love, right? So for example, if your friends only like you if you do certain things, or if your parents only show you love if you do certain things. So notice that if we only have conditional love, what's going to happen is that I need to start limiting. I need to start distorting those shortcomings, right? And now that is going to lead me to feel worthy of affection, right? I start thinking, well, the love that I have for others and that others have from me, I should say, is conditional. The only way my parents are going to love me is if I'm an engineer. The only way my parents are going to love me is if I get a degree in business. The only way my parents are going to love me is if I marry this type of person. But notice that love is conditional. So what's going to happen is now I need to start changing my view. Well, maybe I should be an engineer. Maybe I need to do that, because otherwise, if I don't do that, I will not be worthy of those individuals' love, right? I'm not going to be worthy of their affection. The problem is that it's going to lead to an incongruent self-concept, right? It's going to lead you to have a self-concept that does not align with your concept of your own. So could I have gotten a degree in engineering? I mean, sure. I think I would have done it, and I could have done it. But notice that my self-concept and getting a degree in engineering, would these match? It wasn't going to match, because my idea, I either wanted to be an attorney or a professor, which, by the way, I have an appointment on Thursday to talk about getting another doctorate. Aren't I crazy? A doctorate in law, right, to become a prosecutor. So yeah, that was my other career choice. But notice that is part of my self-concept. It's something that I would like to reach. So me having a doctorate and becoming a professor, or me becoming a prosecutor, that is my self-concept. But conditionally, my family from my mother's side wanted me to be an engineer, because we already had a couple in my family. So notice that self-concept was not going to align. That was going to lead to what? To incongruence. Because if I had become an engineer to satisfy that conditional love, notice that would have been a little difficult. Eventually, they accepted I wasn't going to be an engineer, especially when I started getting really good grades. My family was like, oh, well, guess she ain't going to be an engineer. She's doing all right. So notice that would lead to conditioned love. Notice that because you have that incongruent self-concept, I don't want to be an engineer, I don't want to be a business person. Notice that is going to lead to recurrent anxiety, because your self-concept is not aligning. It's not aligning to the expectation that you had for yourself. Notice that now you may start engaging in defensive behavior. And what is that defensive behavior going to do? That defensive behavior is there to protect, ironically, that inaccurate self-concept. So if we revert back to our previous illustration, notice that now you are incongruent, right? This is your idea of self-concept. Maybe you want it to be a police officer. Maybe you want it to be something else other than an engineer. But your actual experience is, I'm an engineer now, right? So I wanted to be an attorney and I wanted to be a professor. So that was my self-concept, right? And notice that my actual experience, had I gone, bless you, had I gone to the field of engineering, notice that I'm going to start defending this incongruence. No, that was the best choice because it's a lucrative field. With a bachelor's degree, I can get a really good entry job. It pays really good money, or it makes my parents happy. I want my parents to be proud of me. So notice that you're going to start defending this incongruence. But that defense of that incongruence is going to lead to what? It's going to lead to recurrent anxiety, right? It's going to lead to recurrent anxiety. So any questions about how that can lead to aspects of your personality? Good deal. We do see this extensively, especially with younger persons, because we're still trying to find, especially in adolescence and early adulthood, because we're still trying to find that conditioned love. What is therapy? Unconditioned love, right? Therapy is an aspect, if you do engage in this process of person-centered theory and things of that nature, notice that a lot of our training falls in the aspect of unconditional love. And why is that? Because if I am not judging you, if I am not trying to impart judgment, well, that's not the best career for you, and you go to therapy, or maybe you should have done that, or maybe you should do this. Notice that then you're not going to be able to show your true self-concept, right? How are we going to reach, right, that self-concept if I am judging you in therapy, right? So if you have a mental illness, if you have an aspect that may be taboo, so for example, you have a fetish, or you have some sort of, let's say, maladaptive behaviors. Just say, for example, you find yourself being attracted to children. So if I am judging you for this behavior, how are you going to get better, right? How are you going to do better? So notice that part of therapy is to provide that non-judgmental process, provide a setting for you in which you are able to see, okay, my therapist is not judging me for this. But notice that some individuals might. So for example, in my case, my family wanted me to go at least in civil engineering. We had a lot of computer engineers back in the day. So they went out, you do civil engineering or something like that. And I figured, that's the most interesting. And I actually consider and I did go to an engineering school just like this one, but I went to liberal arts. Go figure. So I still didn't do that. So any questions? Fantastic. How do we inform? How do we inform this type of humanistic perspective? This is immensely important, especially for those of you who are particularly fond of the humanistic perspective. I do like the humanistic perspective a lot because it allows for the person to grow. It allows for the person to become a better version of themselves, I should say. But how is it that I inform this practice? Well, notice that Abraham Maslow proposed the theory of self-actualization. And you did hear me use that term before. We're actually going to define it very much in detail very, very shortly. Notice that Maslow proposed the hierarchy of needs, right? The hierarchy of needs. This is immensely useful for understanding behavior, therapy, mental illness. It is so immensely useful to provide an explanation. Notice that every time you see the word theory, I always want you to equate it to the term explanation. So what is the explanation of self-actualization? Well, notice that it is in the shape of a pyramid, and that's not a coincidence, because the idea is that based on that lower level, right? Based on that lower level, notice that each lower level has to be satisfied, right? Has to be satisfied in order for us to move to a next level of needs, right? keeping with our illustrations, remember, Maslow proposed that in order for us to be able to move to fulfillment, right? In order for us to move towards fulfillment, we need to satisfy the need that was under it. So for example, one of the first needs, right? One of the first needs that we have to satisfy, right, are those physiological needs, the physiological needs. Notice that the physiological needs and the safety needs fall under the realm of basic needs, Notice that the lower the section, the lower the level, the more necessary they are to survive, right? So for example, if you didn't have food, water, and shelter, notice that you wouldn't survive, would you? And if you didn't have safety, would it be difficult to survive? I mean, you could survive in a very dangerous situation, but are you becoming self-fulfilled? Are you becoming self-actualized? So his proposal is you need to satisfy the lower tier first before you can move on to the higher level and to the higher level. Notice that in the first aspect, we are dealing with physiological needs. So for example, say sexual desire, reproduction, thirst, hunger, and later when this need is satisfied, then you can move towards the safety needs. This is when we're talking about aspects of security. We are talking about long-term survival, right? So some of you, for instance, you have shelter, you have food, but notice that you live in a really bad neighborhood, right? You live in a really bad place, a really tough situation. Could you survive? Sure. Was it easy? Probably not. Can you become self-actualized and have the highest level of achievement you could? You could, but is it probable? It's very unlikely because you're not satisfying other needs to become self-actualized. So we revert back to our illustration. Notice that if you were able to satisfy safety, right? If you were able to satisfy physiological needs, we would start moving into psychological needs. Within the psychological needs, we are going to have love and belongingness, right? You're going to see this immensely. This is when a lot of our clients would generally be, because I hate to say it, but a lot of individuals cannot afford going to therapy. And that is because some of the monetary aspects are not fulfilled. So notice that they need to satisfy safety needs and physiological needs before we can start working a little bit in those psychological perspectives. Let's talk a little bit more about the level of love and belongingness according to Abraham Maslow. So notice that in love and belongingness, we're talking about intimate relationships. I don't mean necessarily sexual, because sexual will fall within the physiological needs. I'm talking more about, do you have a partner that you're intimate with, that you can actually share experiences and thoughts with? Do you have friends that you could actually share aspects of hurt, aspects of love, aspects of happiness? So we start seeing aspects of being intimate with an individual. Also, the sense of, say, affiliation, right? I am trying to become affiliated with a group. So for example, being part of a group that appreciates me. So for example, maybe you're in a gamer club, maybe you're in an anime club, right? Maybe you're in an engineering club. So notice that now you have that affiliation of people that are appreciating you and that are accepting you, right? So for example, you're in a group of anime clubs or engineering people who are there to accept you. So that is one of the aspects of the belongingness and love need. Now, once that is satisfied, now we can move towards our next level, which would be within the psychological needs, and that is esteem. I like to think about esteem as being recognized, as being having a sense of accomplishment, right? So knowing that other individuals do indeed recognize your efforts. Notice that here you are trying to gain achievement, right? You're trying to gain achievement. Now, one of the next needs that I try to look into, this pyramid does not break it down a little bit more into detail, but we can also have cognitive needs. And in that specific state, if we revert back to your presentation, you'll see that part of those needs involve cognitive needs. So this is your need to have knowledge and understanding. This is when you start seeing people who are researchers, who are entrepreneurs, and look into aspects of learning. Other individuals, so for example, artists, individuals who appreciate art, can also fall within the realm of looking and appreciating beauty. People who are, say, for example, into nature, those people have indeed moved up into another sense. Now, any questions so far about the levels that I've covered? And you're thinking, well, what does it take to feel and be self-actualized, right? Well, notice that in the illustration that I gave you, notice that the last thing that you will be able to achieve is that self-fulfillment need. Notice that in this particular case, it is the tip of that pyramid, meaning that it is the hardest to achieve for any individual, which is basically you have realized your full potential. Basically, just like that army slogan, you are all you can be, right? This is when people become creative. This is when people find an opportunity that makes them be comfortable and feel like they have reached what they need to reach. I have to tell you, most individuals never reach their full potential. So most individuals never reach this stage. So most of us are never going to know what being self-actualized is. Notice that the only way for me to move upward is that I satisfy that previous need. So for example, if I satisfy my physiological needs, I will be able to progress and move to the next level. If I satisfy the needs of safety and security, I can move into belongingness and love. But notice that if I am not able to satisfy those needs, notice that I'm going to regress. I'm going to go down a level. So for example, I in my jobs, my jobs are something that I'm really grateful for. So notice that I have safety and security, but say I lost most of my jobs today, I'm going to regress because that need for safety and security, maybe I can afford where I live, right? So maybe I would need to go to a very dangerous place and live. Now, again, most people never reach their self-actualization. So part of the self-actualization is actually knowing what your strengths are and dealing with deficiencies. And deficiencies are when that need is not satisfied, right? When that need is not satisfied, that is what we refer to a deficiency. I don't want you to think of deficiency as fault, because a lot of people do tend to equate the two. A deficiency in this specific case, in the humanistic perspective, is not a fault. Imagine when you have a vitamin D deficiency, right? It's not like you're bad at vitamin D, you simply do not have enough. So just like with nutrients, so we may have a limitation with vitamin D, so is the case here, right? Just because you have a deficiency doesn't mean that it cannot be addressed. So one of the things that I would like to consider myself, and I'm using myself as an example so that, I don't offend anybody. So one of the things that will make me feel sexualized is exactly this, being able to impart knowledge. So hopefully whatever bits and pieces you learn here are going to help you be a better member of society. So that's my idea of being self-actualized, is helping other individuals with their learning, helping my own patients so they can become better and contributor members of society, or with the inmates that I used to work with, hopefully that they become better members of society. So that's my idea of self-actualization. For some of you, it may be, I want to be a good father to my children. That would make me feel that I have reached the highest potential that I could have. And if that's your idea of self-actualization, by satisfying the lower tier, you can move to the next tier, the next tier, and the next tier, and hopefully you can have that idea of self-actualization. So any questions about that? Any questions? Good deal. Fantastic. Hashtag fantastic. I haven't said that in a while. You guys are letting me, I'm slacking. You guys need to tell me when I'm not saying fantastic. Now I keep saying self-actualization, right? I keep utilizing this term. Notice that we have a drive. We have a natural instinctive drive to move towards personal growth, right? So for instance, if you're in the lower level of hunger, of physiological needs, and you have hunger, you have thirst, you have the desire to have sex and reproduce, notice that you have a natural drive to try to reach the next level and the next level and the next level. So when I was referring to self-actualization, remember that means to fulfill your own potential. But like I said, most people never reach this level, but some individuals do. And what does this look like, right? What are the characteristics of individuals who have reached their maximal potential? Notice that these individuals are clear, they are efficient, they are actually comfortable. They are comfortable with the perception of reality. Most of us would like to say, you know, there's different versions of the truth, your truth, my truth, and what actually happened. People who are self-actualized are comfortable with what actually happened. Those individuals are indeed aware of aspects of reality. Generally, these people are simple, right? I tell my friends that I'm a simple girl with simple needs, right? Because I like to think about it's usually the simple things that allow us to have more happiness. Notice that they view problems in regards to problems. They do and view their problems as an outside, right? They view their problems as an outside source, and that they must do something to address it. So notice that most of us would say, if I am sad, or say there's a problem, right? Say, for example, you start getting an F in this class and you complete zero, you have a zero in this class. Most of us would say, well, it's the book's fault, the lecture's fault, is Dr. Shar's fault, or it's the university's fault, or the department. Most of us view problems in that way, right? Well, the external aspect. Now, notice that a lot of individuals also view the internal sense. So for example, I'm stupid, I can learn this class, or I don't have the ability to pass my engineering classes. But notice that someone who has become self-actualized would say, okay, there's a problem, what can I do about it? How can I fix this situation? Normally, and I won't necessarily cover all of these, but notice that in one of the significant aspects that I like to look into, these people tend to be very democratic in nature. So for example, they're not necessarily, well, it's my way because it is my way and this is the way it's going to be because I said so. They tend to be a little bit more open. They tend to be a little bit more democratic. So I would like to believe I'm self-actualized. I'm not, but I like to believe it. So for example, so say if I made a mistake in one of the exams, right? So I did add a couple questions that Dr. Abby mentioned, maybe you shouldn't include that because I am more democratic in nature. I would say, okay, let me acknowledge that. Let me look into the questions and see if I actually made a mistake. Yes, sir.
Just to clarify, you don't mean the political party there, right?
No.
Okay.
Democratic, I mean more like that a consensus, right? I mean like the strict definition of democratic, right? Not Republican, libertarian, not all that. We don't do that here. No, sir, no. Although, fun little fact about me, so you guys get to know me a little better. I would like to run for politics someday. I don't know, maybe I'm getting too old for that now, but I would like to someday. But when I mean democratic, I don't mean the political sense. I mean more that they try to have a consensus, right? They try to look for the characteristics of everybody instead for an authoritarian, say, for example, like a dictatorship, right? And some of us know people like that. You're gonna do what I said when I said so, how I said so, because I said so, right? So a self-actualized person is not like that. They tend to be a little more democratic, more open. And one of the other things that I like to mention about self-actualized people, notice that they learn how to balance, right? They learn how to balance the polarities in personality. So if you recall from previous lectures, right? If you recall from our previous lecture, you'll remember that we had aspects of personality. So remember, we have, for example, aspects of being extroverted or introverted, for example. So notice that a person that has become self-actualized understands the balance between each of the lines of personality. So they're not going to stay just within one aspect. So for example, a person who is self-actualized would not necessarily always be extroverted or always be introverted. They try to find somewhat of a balance. So any questions about that? All right, so let's look at other aspects that could influence our personality. Let's talk a little bit more about the genetic aspects of personality. So in regards to Hans Eysenck, right, he proposed, contrary to, say, for example, other perspectives. So say, example, behaviorism, which would say, oh, you're influenced by your environment. And that's why you behave the way you behave, right? Because of operant conditioning, because of modeling. But notice that Eysenck would say, that's not true. I think that your behavior, that your personality, I should say, is very much so, very largely, not entirely, but immensely likely, and shaped by your genes, based on your hereditary factor. Notice that he would describe personality not so much as traits like the ones we observed earlier in previous lectures or with our big five, but notice that he would align them in hierarchies, right? He would consider that there are lower levels, that are lower traits, and that there are higher traits, right? There are higher traits of personality, and then some of them are lower. There's some of them are not necessarily the best traits. Now, notice that your genes are going to lead you to a habit, right? And remember, when we are talking about personality, if you recall our definition of personality from our previous lecture, and as I will mention again, is that personality, it's basically your consistency, how you respond, right? How you carry yourself. Think about if you are in a club, right? You're going to respond the same way at a club that you would at a bar, that you would at a family gathering, because if you're extroverted, I can predict how you're going to behave at the club, at the bar, at a social gathering, right? Whereas he would propose that your genes are the ones that determine that habit, and your genes are the ones that are going to determine that habitual response. Now, he engaged in twin studies. In order to look into the big five personality traits that we had mentioned in our previous lecture, which of course will be linked in the description down below. Now, notice that in regards to his explanation, right? Notice that one of the traits that he considered to be a higher order trait was extroversion, right? And what were the traits that come, right? That come with being extroverted. So this is an example. So notice that he would say a person who is extroverted will be sociable, will be active, as a person who is assertive. And notice that I can expect a response. So for example, if I have, say, a person who's extroverted and sociable, look into his response. So we would expect that this person is going to behave a certain way. And then say at the club, at the bar, at social gathering, how are they going to respond? Well, then we can move into a specific response. So say, for example, they are talkative, they engage in jokes, they include other people. Now, there are other views to understand personality. And interestingly, we look into the evolutionary perspectives of personality. This is one that I particularly enjoy because it allows for the explanation of being able to understand some of the aspects of personality. So according to the evolutionary approaches to personality, remember that whenever you see the term evolution, I want you to equate it to adaptation, right? How something adapts to something else, right? It's how a species adapt to their environment and circumstances as a whole. So, and in an evolutionary sense, we would argue that personality has a biological foundation, right? And why is that? Because natural selection favored that particular personality, right? Favored that particular characteristics, right? If you recall from aspects of evolution that we have taught in our previous chapters, particularly for those of biopsychology, notice that this argument would say, because of a species, we have favored certain personality traits. So let's think a little bit more about personality traits that we think are socially acceptable, right? So being agreeable with other people is a socially acceptable personality trait. Being empathetic is also another characteristic that we would deem as socially acceptable, right? But when we have an individual who is psychopathic, right? An individual who does not engage in being empathetic with other people, that might be a person who exploits other people for their own interests. Notice that those individuals are going to be starting to be removed from society. So according to evolutionary psychology, we're actually naturally selecting individuals who have traits of empathy and are agreeable, and basically moving individuals away, right? Moving individuals away, say, for example, that are, say, for example, not empathetic, right? And people who are psychopathic. So the idea, according to evolutionary psychology, is we're going to favor individuals that indeed have been adapting to their society. So any questions about that? Good deal. Good deal. Now, when we are thinking about evolutionary psychology and other biological factors, so for example, genes as a contributor to your personality, we do have evidence. We do have evidence to support that. So we do understand the biological factors do indeed shape your personality. Now, one of the main criticisms, right? One of the main is that we are putting way too much emphasis, I should say, to that hereditary factor, right? And another criticism is that we know per research that genetics are influenced by the environment, right? You can be the smartest person genetic-wise. You could have had the best genes on the planet to be smart. You could have had the best genes on the planet to be extroverted. But notice that it will be really difficult for that gene to manifest itself if you're not exposed to the correct environment for that gene to be able to express itself. So we do know, yes, there is a genetic component, but we also need that environment in order for it to be represented. Oh boy, I think a lot of us really like this topic. Yeah, I see a couple of smiley faces, half faces though, like, just half faces, right? What is narcissism? Narcissism, my dear ladies and gents and everything in between, is a personality trait, right? It is a personality trait, right? Just like psychopathy, by the way, it's also a trait. Notice that people who are narcissistic generally have a high sense of importance. They also have a high need for admiration. But I would argue most importantly, they have a high tendency to exploit other people. They do have a tendency to exploit other people. Notice that most narcissistic individuals are often really liked by others. Generally, people usually like narcissists a whole lot at first, right? Let me put that caveat right there. You're thinking about someone who, portrays a sense of admiration, like, well, I like this guy, I like this lady, they have it going on, right? But notice that at the beginning, these individuals will be well liked, but the sense of exploitation tends to come up, and that popularity, that sense of liking them starts to increase. There are two types of narcissism and their traits. So one of the types that we're going to look into is grandiose narcissism. And in this particular case, we have aspects of a person being arrogant. Generally, there is a high sense of extroversion. The person tends to not be modest whatsoever, and they may show some form of aggression, right? They may show some form of aggression. Notice that another type of narcissism is that of being vulnerable, right? Notice that these individuals have a strong sense of inferiority, which, I would argue that this sense of inferiority feeds that sense of importance. I feel inadequate. I feel sad. I feel that I am inferior. Therefore, let me inflate my sense of importance. Look how important I am. Don't look at how inferior I look like, though. Focus on that sense of importance. Admire me, not so much that sense of inferiority. And notice that by the same token, they also have a high sense of recognition. So any questions about that? Any questions? Good deal. Good deal. Notice that culture, right? Culture is going to play a significant role when it comes to your personality. We used to not care about culture, by the way. We used to, in psychology, we didn't think it was important. We didn't think it actually had a significant role. But with research, we have come to the understanding that yes, culture does have a role, if not in everything, but many of the factors that we considered in psychology. Notice that those basic dimensions that we mentioned, particularly with the big five, notice that we can find them basically anywhere. We can find these characteristics in any culture, right? So aspects of being, say, for example, extroverted and introverted and things of that nature, you will be able to find them basically everywhere. Now, think of us good old American folk, right? Us good old American people. Notice that one of the aspects that we foster immensely is a sense of independence, right? We don't have a sense of collectivism that we will find in other cultures. So for example, some African cultures, some Latin American cultures, in which the sense, and Asian cultures as well, there is a big sense of collectivism, right? There's a huge sense of, it's not so much about me, it's about my family, about my community. Whereas here in America, it's like, no, I need to work on myself first. Like I need to get my money, I need to get my career, I need to get my own stuff before I can do something collectively. Whereas in other cultures, it's more about, I'm going to do this thing so that I can satisfy the family, right? That I can satisfy my community. Any questions so far about how culture may shape your personality? All right, let's talk about the MMPI. Let's look at the MMPI. The MMPI, it's something that I have administered to clients and that I have administered to my cute little self. Because if you want to be a good practitioner in the future, one of the best pieces of advice that I received from one of my professors back in the day, any assessment you give to your patients, you should do it yourself first, right? You should always do it yourself so that you know the struggles that the person may have and their experience once they actually do it. The MMPI is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. this as an immensely popular, immensely validated, immensely researched and standardized instrument that has 10 personality traits, right? It examines 10 personality traits that are thought to be symptomatic when extreme, right? So for example, if I am viewing narcissism, when viewed in the extreme, it could be pathological, right? It could become a symptom. It could become a characteristic of a disorder. And how does it work? Well, generally personality tests as a whole, usually are self-administered, right? So the person answers many questions. And in this specific case, they are trying to reply to answers regarding their personality, right? And the NEO is also one that is very similar. It's a little bit, I would say, I don't want to say it's less comprehensive, but the MMPI has closer to 600 questions, by the way. All right, so in order to provide you with an illustration of what an actual MMPI looks like, notice that the MMPI, it's kind of similar to what a lot of the standardized assessments look like. So notice that you basically fill in and you answer whether or not that particular item represents your behavior or your symptoms and or personality traits. And notice that it's simply true or false. Notice that it's in the closer range of 600 questions. So notice that it's about 567. You would have to conduct statistical analysis, right? So you have to conduct statistical analysis. And then this is what that profile will look like, that profile for clinical scales. And what is a clinical scale? That is that represents something that could be pathological. So notice anything that falls within this range, right? It's generally considered normal, right? So it's generally not necessarily pathological, but notice that things that fall outside of that realm. So for example, this scale here is falling outside of that normal range for a female. Notice that this one is also falling outside of the range. This measures a wide variety of personality traits. It's immensely interesting to view. It is immensely interesting to administer. So let me show you what those look like, right? Let me show you what those will look like in a much more simplistic sense, because I know that that one is a little bit harder to manage. So let's look at a more simplified version of it. So notice that these are not, these are just a representation. So notice that everything that falls within those two lines would be considered normal range, so not necessarily a pathology. But notice that in this particular case, so for example, notice that in this case, right, the person has a high level of depression. Notice that this individual is also showing aspects of hysteria. Notice that the person is psychopathic, so we're doing well. Yeah, we're doing well. And notice that the orange represents a normal person. Notice that the purple represents a person who is schizophrenic. And then notice that the green represents a person who is depressed. So this would be an immensely simplified version of what the actual statistical analysis would look like in real life, but it's a really neat illustration. It's a really neat illustration. Yes, ma'am. So the question that Dr. Nunez was asking, what if it falls under that normal range? I will explore that later with the person. So, and I'll give you an example. There is a scale that is not illustrated here, but there is a scale, there's 3, if I'm not mistaken, that measure if you lie, right? Measure the tendency of the person to be dishonest. So think about if the person, normally, most people tell lies, right? So you would expect that scale to be around here for responses. But what would happen if the person's score was really low with lying? That can mean that that person is crying for help, that they want help, that they want someone to hear them. And most people would say, I don't want them to think I'm so depressed. So let me just, so you will find that they're in their lie scale, what I like to call the lie scale. There's 3, if I'm not mistaken, put here to measure statistically whether or not you are being deceitful when answering these questions. But say if a person scored really low in in lying scales, we would say, okay, this person is being too honest. What are they trying to tell me? Because this scale also measures for suicide ideation. So if you see, for example, the person scored really low in lying, but then their suicide is above normal, the tendency of wanting to take one's life, notice that this person is asking me for help or suicide, right? So scoring really low is also up for interpretation, right? In this case, I would say the person wants help for suicide. So any questions?